Hello everyone, Eric Teacher here, and today we are going to continue talking about knowledge encyclopedia history, continuing on to the age of exploration. In this video, we're going to ask ourselves, why did people want to explore? We're going to ask ourselves, what happens when a country chooses to explore the world, perhaps even try to conquer it? And what happens when a country chooses to isolate, when they decide that they're going to focus more inward on themselves and not branch out into the world? And last, we're going to talk about the different ways that we are exploring today. And with that, let's get right into it. So let's start with, why do people explore? And, I see we already have a question. Okay, yeah, so don't people just explore because they're curious? That is a good question, and we are very curious. We are a very curious animal, right? Like, we are always seeking to find new things, but that is not the reason why we were willing to brave the oceans, especially ones at this time that we didn't even know if they really had an end. So here are the three big reasons why suddenly so many countries in Europe decided to jump onto boats and just hope for the best. So the first one I have here is, of course, economic gain, which is just getting things like gold, silver, jewels. These sorts of things were big promises to countries that were looking to become richer, to become more wealthy, right? And so for many countries, especially ones that were wanting to do more trade with Asia, finding an alternative route to get to Asia to trade for spices and other sort of more exotic foreign things that they didn't have in Europe, a shorter path other than the one all the way down Africa was really important, especially if it would save time. And so this idea of possibly gaining more trade, more money, even more gold, because once the New World is found during this age, and I believe it was Christopher Columbus himself had found that the natives he had run into, because he did think that he had made it to all the way to India, knew about the pearls that were in the oysters under the ocean. And so, not necessarily the ocean, but he would have them dive down and get these so that he could bring them back as proof that he's found wealth in a new country. So that was a big thing, because once that happened, we started sending more and more ships across the Atlantic Ocean. Then one of the next big pushes for people to start getting on to boats and exploring was, once they did find out that there was a whole continent of people that had not been exposed to European ideas, it was a perfect opportunity, because the church in the previous age had become really strong and was weakening a bit, because there were some divides in how we should worship the Christian God. So different groups are starting to form. And so these groups believe that they have the proper way to worship God. And Christianity itself says that you need to spread the word, especially to those who don't know. And here is a whole continent of people who don't know about God. And so for them, it was this good and righteous thing to do, to hop on a boat, go over there, and try to convert these people who had never heard of Jesus or God to their ideas. And then lastly, we also have imperial ambition, which is just a big word for glory. So once they did find that there was all this land up for grabs, all these resources that uh, were not there in Europe, or they were more abundant, there was just more of it in the Americas, they decided that they could use that to gain power. Because, nothing says that you are a powerful country like having more land than any other country by claiming it, right? And the more land you have, the more access to resources, such as like metals for making weapons. Earlier, I mentioned the idea of like gold and silver and minerals, but also just access to more things like trees and water that you could keep and stockpile. So, to have all of these resources would make you one powerful country. And so many European countries decided that they were going to go over there so that they could become more powerful as a result. And with that, let's keep going and let's explore maybe some of the other ideas of countries that chose not to go out there and explore. Exploration versus isolation. To explore or not to explore? That's the question we're asking here. With exploration, we are able to have access to new trade, which gives us access to new resources, which is able to make a country more wealthy. It also allows for a cultural exchange, an exchanging of ideas that can help a country to grow in ways it couldn't have done by itself. And then, of course, with exchanging and trading, there's also technology that is exchanged and traded, which allows all countries involved to benefit. Because if one country doesn't have for example, at this time we are seeing the rise of guns. If one country does not have guns and they become, in a cultural exchange, a trade with another country that does, now both countries are able to have guns. It's possible that one can even improve on that and then trade back. And so this can be important for the growth that we see in this time of countries like Spain and England and France. And then on the other side, we have isolation, which can be sort of negative when we look at it here, because I do have written that it can lead to stagnation. So if a country's not exploring and it's just choosing to do its own thing, then new ideas are harder to come by because the people of the country are not influenced by any ideas outside of its own country that could lead it to grow faster. Then it also has limited access to resources. If a country does not have a lot of good materials to work with, then unless it trades, unless it really branches out to try and make new relationships with other countries, or as some of the European countries did, just conquer and take over lands and take their resources, then it's harder to grow. And when it's harder to grow, there are missed opportunities to grow. And by that, I mean it will not have the same choices that a country that can trade or that decides to explore has. Its choices will be much more limited because it's only going to need to discuss within itself with the resources it has to make decisions. And on the whole, that seems like it might be, oh, well, isolation is just all negatives, it's a bad thing. But it's not, because in a lot of the countries that decide to isolate too, we see a very unique culture form, a very strong culture. We also see new types of art that start to develop in these countries that are unique to that country itself, that we don't see around the world. For example, we see it in Korea, and at this time, Japan is also trying to isolate itself. And so we see unique art forms forming in both that are completely different from anywhere else in the world. So when we explore, we do see rapid change, but it also can destroy existing civilizations. Just ask the Native Americans if they think that exploration was a good idea. They did not choose to isolate, but they ended up being their own nation of isolation due to not having access to the kinds of ships and boats that were able to cover large oceans, right? And that has led to essentially being fully colonized and conquered by European settlers. Then we also have isolation is able to preserve the culture. It's able to keep the culture the same, but at the expense of not having those opportunities that come with trading and trading to get new technology and wealth and money. It's all circulating inward. And so let's look at some two very specific countries to maybe help get a better idea of how this works. So here we have Spain versus Korea. Spain, a country that chose exploration, and Korea, a country that chose isolation during this age in history. So if you're ever lost on what or why I'm talking about certain things, you can always look at the bottom here at these purple text and see the question that I'm addressing. And for this question, you need to pick two countries and sort of compare them and see which one, what kinds of progress they made. So for Spain, the progress it made is that first off, it gained a huge empire. It claimed so much land in the Americas, and it forced its culture onto the people, the natives of the area. And it did this for, as I mentioned earlier, gold, God, and glory. They wanted the wealth that was in America, so they went and took it. They felt that their religion required them to spread it, so they were not just spreading the religion, but they were also needed to spread their language so that they could understand their religion. And as a result, they changed the Americas forever. We still, to this day, feel the impact of Spain in the Americas because we still have many countries that speak the Spanish language, for that matter. And there's so much more to it. But like I said, I don't want to talk too much about answers that I think you can find for yourself in our book. Next is Korea, and Korea choosing isolation, which did help it to preserve its culture, and it also did see, unlike what we talked about earlier with isolation, the Joseon era happened during this time with the Joseon dynasty, which of course led to large developments in agriculture, astronomy, medicine, and even developing the Hangul text, the letters, its own alphabet. It saw lots of growth inward, right? We didn't see Korea expanding its empire at this time, but it strengthened its culture. And so it did have its own progress in its own way. And so one of the things to think about is, which do we think is better? Do we think that accumulating lots of wealth and influence, the way that Spain did, is what's important? Or is developing your own culture and society more important? And that's something you might want to think about as you're doing this writing and answering this question. Because you should also look at other countries that decided to explore, like England and France, and other countries that decided to isolate, as I mentioned earlier, like Japan, and see which one had maybe the better outcome, or made the most progress. Because first you need to figure out if, to you, progress is something like wealth and power, or if it's about harmony in your society. And now I want to talk very briefly about different ways that this era, this age, made progress to help you with your decision between is exploration better or isolation better. So let's keep going.